Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Uncovery podcast. My name is Maddie and I recovered from anorexia and I talk about it on this podcast along with a host of other things. Today's episode is a very special one. It is a recording of a talk that I gave at a conference to a bunch of habit coaches, primarily in the fitness and health industry. And it was about nudging towards unintended consequences, specifically about calorie labels on restaurant menus and whether or not this is an impactful, helpful policy or perhaps a detrimental one when we think about diet culture and eating disorders and populations of interest that we are perhaps not thinking about when we are making policy. So I will keep this intro brief. Please enjoy this interview with Sam Salzer.
Okay, welcome back everyone. Hope you had a nice little break and ready for our next presenter, who is Madeline Quinlan. Really excited for Madeline to join us. I have been following her work and think she's doing great things. And to give you some more background, she is a founder of Salient Behavioral Consultants and host of the Uncovery podcast with a fantastic commercial and academic pedigree in application of behavioral science. Residing in Calgary, Canada, she has worked on projects across both private, public, and nonprofit sector and organizations to shift health outcomes using behavioral insights. With her own battle with anorexia and subsequent recovery that's covered actually in her great podcast, it's really, I think, given her, like, she will speak for herself, but following her work, I think it really gives a really multifaceted lens on well-being and I think, fantastic both thought leader and source of insight. So really happy to say welcome, Madeline, to today's event. Hey.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, the stage is yours.
Perfect. All right, let's get into it. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am very, very excited to talk to you today. There are a couple of things in my life that I am the most passionate about, and one is behavioral science, and one is eating disorder recovery. And it is very, very infrequent that I get to have those two things cross over. And so it's an extremely niche thing to be a part of, but to have the opportunity to talk about two things that I care so much about is really an honor and a privilege. So I'm excited to talk to you today. All right, just a little bit about me. My background is actually finance, and then I turned into a behavioral scientist, but I've become very, very passionate about evidence-based policy making or lack thereof. My belief is that radical authenticity, not just in the behavioral science space, but in all aspects of our lives, really helps everybody to grow and learn. One of my superpowers is taking a lot of big ideas and bringing them into relatable stories, and I am a zero inbox person. So that's a little bit about me. The work that I do focuses on behavioral science. The only reason that I'm showing you this is that I think it's applicable to not just our workplaces and when we use behavioral science in the real world, but we can use it in our coaching practices and in our own habit formation, where we really want to understand what is the problem that we are trying to solve, what's the most amount of information and evidence that we can gather to design the most effective intervention we can imagine in order to roll that out, test it, and then look back and see how we did. So this is something that I think we can think about in our coaching practices, not just our applied behavioral science work. I had anorexia for 13 years. And so up until a couple of years ago, when I really got serious about recovery, it all stemmed from, at its very infancy, a diet and really, really poor habits that resulted from this feedback loop that was essentially a destructive one rather than a constructive one. The best time to learn how to swim is not when you are already drowning. And so this idea that we should be supporting people before they are ever falling victim to eating disorders is something that I care a lot about. Being able to identify risk factors, being able to design policies and spaces and contexts that are sensitive to insights about different predispositions to disordered eating and habits that we can ultimately all benefit from. I think that like I said before, storytelling and radical authenticity is something that can save people from, frankly, dying of eating disorders and other mental health illnesses. Telling your story, if you have the ability and the willingness to do so, really helps not just you, but I think all of the people around you that hear your story and can benefit from something like a recovery journey as well. So that was all the impetus for me starting my podcast, Uncovery, was really to say, here's what it's like to go through it in real time, rather than have a retrospective on, oh, I used to have this issue, but now I'm better, to say, here's what it's like day to day to deal with these things. So why does this matter to habits, and why does this matter in coaching? I think it's really important to understand what it is that your personal clients are potentially going through in the rest of their lives that could shape the way that they show up to you and the way that they're going to need a different type of approach or different nuanced discoveries about their lives that are going to help you help them. So you have this superpower as coaches to shape habits, but there's always going to be an influence or a nudge. So if it's not coming from you directly to your clients, it's coming from the external environment, it's coming from their own patterns of behavior, their own historical family systems, things like that. The powerful thing about behavioral science is that it can change behavior. And we know this, and we know that it's robust, and we know that it's evidenced, but we have to be extremely mindful as a result of how we apply it. And so the more knowledge you have as a coach about how to shift habits, the more power that that gives you, the more responsibility that I think that we have to do that with the most mindfulness that we can. Who are we applying certain habit formation tactics with, and under which circumstances, and do those make sense? So I'd be interested to know, and maybe this is just a bit of a self-reflection for anybody that's watching, but how many of you use calorie counting as an intervention within your coaching practice? Calorie counting is something that I did extremely rigorously for years and years and years and years of my eating disorder. But it's something that people use not just within the context of an eating disorder. It's something that is encouraged in a lot of different health contexts. But it doesn't have purely neutral impacts. It's something that can take someone with a predisposition to things like anxiety, disordered body image, eating habits that are potentially problematic, and exacerbating those to a really problematic effect. So because we have highlighted in society that obesity rates are rising, there are a lot of health concerns that are related to diet, there's this increased emphasis on public health interventions. And one of these has been calorie labeling on menus, and has essentially been aiming to guide consumers towards more informed or healthier eating choices. But it's been a really mixed impact, because nutrition labels, including calorie counts, while they are intended to promote healthier eating choices, their effects really vary among different populations. So some studies, which we'll get into in a little bit, show increased awareness without significant behavioral change, and the impact might actually differ across demographic groups as well. Something that this doesn't take into account when we think about the policies around calorie counts on menus is that individuals with either eating disorders or tendencies towards disordered eating can experience a lot of negative consequences due to calorie labeling. So for these individuals, labels might actually reinforce already obsessive behaviors, restrictive habits, or trigger feelings of guilt after eating. And I don't even think that this just applies to people with eating disorders. I think that you could take someone that has a normal or healthy relationship with food, and if you hyper focus on certain tendencies or certain practices, that it can actually spiral people into more destructive nutritional behaviors. But we'll get into that as well. The thing that I usually talk the most about at the beginning of any behavioral science project is, what is the problem that we are ultimately trying to solve? So if we are trying to create a policy that was in support of people's overall health, then we need to understand what we mean by the word health. This is a word that really at this point doesn't mean anything specific. Everybody will have a different version of what this actually means. And so we would need to define this problem really specifically and in the form of a statement. Obesity isn't necessarily good enough or specific enough as a problem that we're trying to solve. Another one is that we're not even really sure who our population of interest are, because if we're looking at the broadest population, and yes, there's a significant percentage of the population that is overweight or obese, and indeed may be suffering health consequences as a result, we actually haven't identified who within that population is our real target for things like calorie counts on menus, and what other subpopulations and groups are we not thinking about that might all be lumped into exposure to this particular intervention and be impacted as a result. And then finally, what's the actual behavior that we're trying to change? Because the behavior has to have a direct impact on our problem of interest. Otherwise, why would we try to change it? So if we thought that having calorie counts on menus was indeed going to decrease people's eating amounts during that meal, we would have to be pretty confident that that behavior would ultimately solve the problem of obesity that we're addressing on a policy level. And I am not convinced that any of this is what's actually going on within this policy. So I'm not going to obviously take you through the nitty-gritty of each of these studies, but through basically what has been a literature review, the evidence that has shaped this policy, if the policymakers indeed even did set out to do a literature review, they would have found that the evidence is shaky at best. With almost all of the calorie labeling and food choice research, we find that it's mostly neutrally effective. The impacts are varied among different demographic groups. And even in the highest, most robust systematic meta-analysis that I could come across of the studies that have to do with menu calorie labeling, it actually only decreased people's consumption by around 18 calories in a meal. And I'm sure all of you can imagine that 18 calories is like a couple of almonds, basically, of a difference. So we're using a broad-based policy approach that actually doesn't seem to be doing what we think it's doing, much less impacting the actual problem that we're trying to solve. So it doesn't seem to be that we have a consistent result when it comes to the research on calorie labels on menus. We also have some pretty robust evidence that this kind of information can actually create issues with those with restrictive eating patterns. It reinforces limiting food intake, and seeing the number of calories can actually act as a detriment from consuming enough food, in particular vulnerable populations. Not to mention that nutrition labels are often misinterpreted. So people don't actually know a lot about what things mean within a particular calorie label, nutrition label. And it's a much oversimplified way to be looking at any given meal, much less your entire nutritional profile. So that's what they did measure, and that looks shaky to begin with. But what they didn't measure were any spillover behaviors, longer term outcomes, or mental impact, or mood or self-esteem impacts as well. So a spillover effect, for anybody that is not familiar, is essentially a secondary behavior that results after a first behavior. So this is kind of a straightforward example, but if someone goes for a run after work and then they want to keep up the good work and they want to eat healthy as well. I ran an hour, let's keep up the good work. I'm going to eat healthy tonight as well. That's a promoting spillover. A permitting spillover is I went for a run after work, so I deserve a big slice of cake. And, you know, we can get into debates about whether or not that's a healthy mindset to have, but that's what we would call a permitting spillover. If we didn't go for a run after work, we sat on the sofa, a purging spillover effect would be, oh, I've been lazy, so maybe I will not eat so much tonight. And a promoting spillover effect, again, is kind of a what the heck effect, where I've been lazy today, so might as well just throw it all out and I'll just have a big slice of cake. So none of these spillover effects were part of the research that went into whether or not calorie labels would decrease people's intake during restaurant meals. And the problem with not having spillover effects measured is that we don't know if there are potentially unintended consequences that we're not accounting for within our policy intervention. What this does is this risks something called demonization. And especially when it comes to calories, we just aren't being honest about what that information tells us, and much less tells the general population. As coaches, and especially within the health space, we tend to have a better idea of what constitutes good health, what a calorie really is, what nutrition kind of shapes up to be. But the general population doesn't have all of that insight necessarily. We know, and we should know, that calories are not a straightforward measurement of health. And so if we're trying to increase the health of the general population, that's not going to get us there. Calorie counts are also wildly inaccurate, and they're extremely poorly regulated. So up to a 20% difference, either above or below what an actual calorie measurement is acceptable on these labels. So that's a huge swing. So we're not even looking at the right numbers if we are looking at them. Foods are treated by different individual bodies and metabolisms differently. And so what might be appropriate for one person might not be appropriate for another. So it's really difficult to standardize these across all kinds of different menus and interventions. And things like the red, yellow, green light systems, they don't take into account that some people would require different types of macronutrients. Different types of food are going to work better for certain bodies. People have different intolerances. Some people can absorb vitamins differently. The point being that if we're demonizing food, or we're thinking that more calories is just bad, what this can do is actually exacerbate food focus. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be in people that have eating disorders, but it can increase binging behaviors and restrictive compensatory cycles. So this sort of restrict, wind that spring tighter and tighter, and then eventually it kind of releases and we see these binging behaviors. And this is really problematic and has the potential to destroy people's relationships with food. They also ignored in most of those studies the psychological impact on those with eating disorders, and actually those that may not have diagnosable eating disorders, but just have risks of disordered eating patterns. Now, one of the really interesting correlations that they found in one of these studies was that the really effective example of calorie counts working is that those happened to be higher in women and in health conscious individuals. What we also know about women and health conscious individuals is that they're much more likely to have or experience an eating disorder at any point in their lives. And often healthy behaviors, quote unquote, are used as, and I can attest to this personally, a mask for what is indeed a very real, deeply rooted eating disorder. So we have habit loops, this idea of cue, routine, and reward. And we think of this as a real positive, right? We want people to have something that stimulates a behavior, have them follow through with the behavior, and then feel rewarded by the behavior. But habit loops work both ways. So it's a misfire of a certain part of a person's brain that has an eating disorder, for example, that they feel rewarded by things that are actually really detrimental to their health and well-being. They still experience the cue, they still experience that routine, which look like the same healthy behaviors that things like these policies would be trying to encourage, but indeed that reward that they're getting is something that's leading them to more and more and more restriction, and actually really, really detrimental to their health overall. So it's something that I think we need to reflect on in our own biases, which is what are our ideas about what a good food is, what a bad food is, what we think about when we think about calories, and what it is that we think about when we think about health. And I want to make sure that I sort of linger here for a second and just say that I'm actually not even a person that believes in trigger warnings. That's a controversial opinion that I have. I think that they are useless at best and impacting people detrimentally at worst. So I do also want to make clear that a counterpoint to this is, well, people out in restaurants that are looking at calorie counts should have the robustness in their own psyche to address those triggers on an ongoing basis if they are in recovery from an eating disorder, for example. And I fully agree with that. The issue is that these policies aren't helping anybody in my measure. And so if they aren't helping anybody, then what's the point in risking having them harm a certain population as well? So two things can be true at the same time. obesity and related physical illnesses is a societal concern. And I think we get into when we're in the eating disorder recovery space, at least, and if anybody has had experience or exposure to this type of content, I think we start to get really scared of saying things like this, that there is a such thing as an unhealthy consequence of an overweight body, and that there are people that individually really are seeking solutions to their health that are related to obesity. And I think that we should be able to say that and understand that that's true. But the causes of obesity and health issues that are related to food are much more complex than just high calorie restaurant meals. And this idea of health that we have is rather skewed. We can't control for every spillover effect as a result of a health policy. I completely acknowledge this. It's impossible to measure and account for and prevent all of that from happening. But we should only be taking calculated risks when it comes to public policy, and only when we're confident that the benefits of our intervention are likely to outweigh the risks and not increase vulnerabilities, unless we're making a really, really huge impact in a positive way in another field. So like a lot of these kind of calorie labeling ideas on the restaurant menus don't also account for the fact that people's behaviors when they get home are different, right? So if they've had a restaurant menu meal and then they feel like they've undereaten at that restaurant menu meal, even though the meal is, well over 1,000 or 1,500 calories, they feel like they've made the right choice. We don't know what they're doing at home or what type of other behaviors they're doing behind the scenes. So we're actually not even sure that the menu label is what's making any difference whatsoever in the real world. So what I think are sort of the solutions, at least at this stage in the game, is that we need to be able to use evidence to form our policies and be honest about the path that we're taking when we're choosing interventions. I think we need to have really frank conversations about complex topics without being afraid of offending people or coming across in a certain light. I think it's important to talk about the evidence. I think it's important to talk about the truth. And ultimately, our social systems and our food systems and our health systems are all very, very integrated and very, very broken. And unless we can sort of address those root causes that are facing citizens, these types of Band-Aid interventions may not just be ineffective, but they can actually be quite dangerous. So a practice that I think might be a takeaway to use, even personally or for your clients, is sort of a riff on mindful eating. I think we've all kind of had these sort of mindful eating. If you've heard of the sort of the raisin exercise, where you have an extremely, extremely focused experience of eating a single raisin and experiencing it in all its textures and tastes, and you're thinking about it and you're looking at it, that type of mindful experience, I think we've seen a lot of that in mindful eating practices. But another one that I think could be powerful is sort of an appreciation for the process of how your food gets to you. So if you have a plate or you have a meal or you have a glass of something and you're thinking about, where did this all come from? Where did this all start? Where does my food really come from? What are all of the inputs that went into it? Who was involved in that process? That gives you not only the mindfulness piece, but it can also create gratitude. And what we know from research is that both of those things actually really impact people's ability to eat mindfully, to stay present, end up being much more aligned and embodied with their physical experience, which I think ultimately is the way that we get to things like intuitive eating. So that is one habit or one little practice that I would leave you with, either for yourself or to use with your clients. And that is all of the content that I have for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a great presentation. And yeah, so many things to dive into here. I guess, quick question from me, I guess. I'm interested because how I thought about, food from a habit point of view is that it's a little bit unique in that anyone you're dealing with, if you're a coach or similar, very rarely, it was basically impossible for someone to have food non-existent habit, basically. Like, there are a lot of things that people could have never done before. Let's say technically they've never been to the gym. That's possible because they're not born in the gym. We're not forced to go there. So it could be that someone has never been to the gym and they're building a gym habit from scratch. Not true with food, right? Everyone has, in some ways, food-related habits that is ingrained. So you kind of like from the get-go, you know that a lot of the behavior that people do related to food is kind of habitual from the get-go. And you have this kind of like the loops that you're describing, potentially some positive ones, but also potentially some of those kind of negative spirals. So yeah, how do you think about that? Like that unique, the food habits being unique in that way, that they're so, from the moment we're born, we're eating, and we're kind of faced into habits through our lives that we maybe don't thoughtfully do, and we end up with them. Yeah, how do you think about that component?
It's a hard one. Food is a really, really difficult one. And I think about this a lot in comparison to things like other addictions, when I compare that to eating disorders, for example, because with a lot of other addictions or habits that you want to stop, you don't have to face those things or be around those things or have a little bit of those things at any point for the rest of your life. Food you have to address every single day, multiple times for the rest of your life. And so building a relationship with food is non-negotiable. It has to be. And if you want to have less anxiety around that and not have to carry that around with you for the entirety of your life, then you have to find some peace and some intuition about it. Like you said, there are things that we've been doing for our entire lives that are sort of these naturally ingrained habits. But I think actually where the problems really come from is we have a natural intuition with our bodies and with food when we are born. It is the societal impact and the input, I think, of forced habits that actually cause these sort of negative loops of behavior in the future. It's getting out of alignment and out of intuition and out of connection with our embodied selves that is actually what's creating more issues in the future. Little kids eat when they're hungry and they stop when they're full, generally speaking, right? So I think it's actually more of a stripping away the layers of things that have been sort of compounded on top of each other, the narratives that we've told ourselves, the narratives that we've gotten from others, mostly that we've gotten from people that stand to make a lot of money off of giving us diet advice and selling us products that we don't need, that are indeed going to mess with our bodies and our minds. So I think it's about stripping that stuff away and actually getting back to really intuitive, embodied relationships with food, which is, granted, much easier said than done, but ultimately that's where our resources would be much better positioned to be.
Yeah, and I think I saw a question that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but basically, if you're someone who is either a coach or maybe you're developing a program through a digital interface like an app or something, and you're onboarding people, supporting them with eating related behaviors, what are kind of basic things that you would expect them to kind of cover to ensure that either things to look out for, but also like what are like some form of hygiene of things to better understand in terms of determining, their food related history and also maybe current set of situation, and also kind of understanding the risk levels in some ways, like in terms of what should be considered with that person. Is there something there that you think is kind of best practices?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? Because as a coach, you aren't necessarily responsible for someone's entire psychological health profile either, right? So if you have people that have eating disorders, they might be looking for a health coach. And part of that might be so that they can sustain and justify their own disordered behaviors. So it's a really difficult position to be in as a coach, because you're not necessarily equipped with all of the diagnostic sort of tools necessary to say, okay, what's going on here? What's really going on here? Is it appropriate for me to even take on this client who is exhibiting a lot of signs of anxiety around food and their body? When does that constitute a higher level of professional intervention that we shouldn't be equipped as coaches to have to take on, that require something that's a little bit stronger? I think if you can educate yourself insofar as is possible as to what eating disorders and disordered eating behaviors and attitudes look like, that would first start with any sort of self-reflection of what are my own weird relationships with food and my body that I might still have. how can I identify that in another person going forward? And so to be really aware of sort of the nuances of certain elements of disordered eating, I think is, for a health coach, I feel like that would be a non-negotiable going forward. Knowing what we know about how many people experience disordered eating and eating disorders, I think that just educating yourself on what to look out for is a really, really key first step. And then to try to be able to integrate that somehow into, let's say you have an entry questionnaire when you onboard a new client, integrating some really intelligent questions about people's relationships with food to unpack whether or not they're either at risk or already entrenched in some kind of disordered eating. I think that would be key, because that goes both ways. It doesn't all have to do with restrictive eating either. We can talk, like, binge eating disorder is the most prominent, and I don't think we talk about that one as much. We have this very kind of strange idea that it's only anorexia, but you have a whole spectrum of different disordered eating patterns.
Yeah, and personal, how to say, thing I just want to shout out is that I'm still, like, it blows my mind how there's so many apps currently that are oftentimes the answer for a lot of people searching for, like, how do I improve my health in some ways from eating. They go to an app, the main intervention is calorie restriction, and they have no way of, like, okay, even putting aside to all of the wonderful things you said about, like, why it doesn't really make sense in the first place, that there's no real way in the onboarding to catch the risks of people getting into bad things, or just, it's just so mind-blowing that it's still such a poorly done thing by the industry. Basically, it's a little bit
It
upsetting. It's like, it's quite frustrating. Yeah,
it's shocking, actually, like that the people that we look to, and online spaces are the worst, I think, for this, in my opinion. Like, social media has its benefits, obviously. A lot of the connections here probably came about through social media and things like that. But if you are not so conscious about the content that you are consuming online as it pertains to health and fitness, you are watching people that have eating disorders sell eating disorders to other people. And that's just the honest truth. The first therapist I ever had, in my resistance to recovery, I was like, well, look at all of these healthy people. They get to go out there and they get to count their calories and they get to do this. And she said to me, those people sit on that couch where you are sitting right now, and they come to me on a weekly basis. They have eating disorders. That's what those people are doing.
And that maybe brings us to this really, I think, interesting question. If you have any thoughts about, someone's facing anorexia, for example, any recommendations or thoughts from your end in terms of how to make that shift or begin making that shift?
Yeah, this is tricky. So this question has to do, I think, with orthorexia specifically.
Oh, orthorexia, sorry.
No, that's okay. So for anyone that's not familiar, orthorexia is essentially an unhealthy level of obsession with only eating quote unquote healthy food. So like really pure foods, clean foods, to such a rigid degree that to deviate from those causes anxiety, that this is actually then a detriment to their ability to take on enough nutrients. So they're just not eating enough or enough variety to keep themselves well. That's orthorexia in a nutshell. It's harder to identify because the behaviors are glamorized and are very celebrated in our day-to-day lives. We really applaud this type of behavior. So it's difficult to identify. In order to sort of make shifts is to make small steps. It is these little tiny steps outside of your comfort zone that are going to get you there. It's really, really hard to ask a person like, hey, I know that you're absolutely terrified of carbohydrates and you haven't had a bagel in 13 years. I'm going to need you to eat a bagel today. They're just not going to do it. So this, it often requires professional intervention from somebody that is a specialist dietitian who works with people with eating disorders. That's usually where I point people to. Resource yourself as much as possible. I don't know if it's up to habit focused coaching or health focused coaching to be walking people out of things like orthorexia. If you think that that's something that somebody's going through or they've disclosed this to you, making sure that they're being supported by another professional, it's either a psychologist or a dietitian who specializes, is going to be really key. You cannot do this alone, and you shouldn't have to. And yes, I do think it's on the rise. Absolutely it is. Yeah. It's just like it's an eating disorder in a prettier package is basically what it is.
Yeah. And, maybe as a final kind of question, a little bit similar, because I think there was also some asking about book recommendations and so on. So if people want to learn more about this, both as individuals and coaches, to better kind of either support themselves or others within kind of this domain, do you have any go-to place to learn more, or to kind of, if it is a book or similar?
Yeah, there are some good books out there. There's one called Life Without Ed. That's a classic kind of eating disorder recovery book. There are some more called Rehabilitate, Rewire, and Recover is a very like direct, straightforward, no nonsense look at eating disorder recovery. I would pitch my podcast in here. It's not a book.
Yeah.
It's not a book yet, but I would definitely check out the Uncovery podcast. We have a lot of guests with a lot deeper knowledge than I have, and then we have a lot of real world people who I've interviewed who have gone through this themselves. And there's a ton of resources in terms of like what to do if you think someone has an eating disorder. What are the different types of eating disorders? What types of professional help and therapy can you get? And then it's also obviously a little of an inside look about what the experience is like as a person with an eating disorder through the lens of my own experience. So hopefully that could help as well. And it's on YouTube now.
Amazing. And I'm already a subscriber, so I'm happy to say that I've enjoyed a lot of episodes. It's been really interesting. And yeah, thanks for all the things you do. Thanks for coming on today and sharing your knowledge and experience. And I think especially, taking this perspective of, even though if you have good intentions sometimes, and nudging for healthy things can also have unintended consequences if we're not thoughtful about how we do that. And I think you've really, said so many great things today. So thank you, Maddie. And have a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Wow, another fantastic presentation. So much. I'm going to ponder now, actually, on the break. I'm going to write some notes, actually, as well. But we're going to take a break, and we're going to be back in a few moments, where we're going to segue and talk a little bit about busy humans. So we're going to talk about how to simplify habit change for busy humans with Meg Willis. So that's going to be happening in about 5 minutes. I would encourage you all, in the meantime, get up from your seat and move a bit, get something to kind of something good to put in your body, and see you back very soon for another interesting session on all things habit formation and behavior change.